All right, we started off talking about some of the techniques and methodologies that archaeologists use just at the very beginning of the course. There are lots more, and you can learn about those through some of the other classes that we have here. Anthropology 201, Introduction to Archaeology is a good one. Anthropology 410, the Archaeological Field School is another good one where we actually put those ideas into practice. Or 411, the Archaeological Lab Methodology course. But for this class, I think it might be useful just to digress for a minute and talk about a couple of the techniques that are really important for understanding the rise of farming, the rise of food production, the rise of more intensive farming that we get with agricultural development over the course of the Neolithic. These are paleoethnobotany and archaeozoology. Already defined these at the beginning of the course, and this slide just sort of shows you the breakdown of the words. Again, I would never test you on the Greek and Latin roots of the words, but I do find it helpful to remember what some of these unfamiliar words mean. So paleo, ethno, botany, old, people, plants. Botany, study of plants, ethno, about a group of people, and paleo, old. So paleoethnobotany is the study of people through old plants, or the study of old people through plants, I suppose, if you like. And archaeozoology, also called faunal archaeology, F-A-U-N-A-L, as opposed to flora, that's flora and fauna opposing each other. Archaeozoology is the study of people in the past through the study of animals. How do we actually get some of this information? Because we talked about the fact that in early on in the class we talked about preservation is not usually very good for much of the material, at least that would be part of paleoethnobotany, the ancient plant remains. We said those things tend to rot away. And actually the largest part of the animals will rot away as well, and we just are left with animal bones. Sometimes those animal bones are really tiny and easily fragmented, and so it's worth thinking about how we actually recover these. The technique for recovering a lot of this material is called flotation. And flotation involves various different kinds of tanks, but you can see one here, a big one made out of an old oil drum. And we actually take soil samples as we're excavating. We try to take the artifacts out of these often, but the whole rest of the sample gets dumped into this big tub of water. And it gets sprayed with hoses and mixed up, and sometimes we even add a certain special kinds of detergents, chemicals called deflocculants, things which is not a rude word, sounds like a rude word, deflocculant, but it actually just means something that breaks up little bits of things, so it breaks up the clumps of clay and dirt and lets the material that's stuck in between them float up to the surface. And most of this material will float, plant remains and even a lot of the little bones and fish scales and things like that. We let the top of the water sort of flow off onto a fine mesh, and you see that here with this person on the right is collecting in this little blue round thing a very fine mesh, sort of a fabric that's collecting all the little tiny bits and pieces that might have survived. And they might have survived because a lot of times material gets burned partially, and the burned things that are burned completely become ash, and we don't have them. Things that don't get burned at all are available for critters to eat and microbes to digest, and so they don't tend to survive. But sometimes the materials that are partially burned actually do survive really well, things that are carbonized. And you imagine this, if you think about like a regular campfire, or if you have a house with a fireplace, when you have a fire in that and you look at it the next morning, think about what it looks like. If you haven't messed around with it, at the very edge, what you'll get are, the unburnt ends of logs that are just sort of as they were when you stuck them in the fire. And, over thousands of years, those ends would rot away. And in the very middle, where the fire was hottest, you have ash. And that ash actually is going to not resemble the plant much that it started off at, and that won't really be available. But in the middle, you have this sort of charred part that still kind of looks like wood. And in fact, if you were to pick up that piece of wood and look at it under a microscope, you'd actually see the cellular structure of the plant intact. And that works for any different kinds of plants. So seeds or bits of potato or tuber or other plant that might have been just at the edge of a fire, in a cooking fire, they're going to survive, and we can recover them through flotation. Just for fun, a couple of images of me about 10 years ago or so, longer depending on how long we keep using this bit of video, back in 2006, 7, something like that, when I was in grad school and a friend of mine decided to make a flotation device, so we got a bunch of things from the hardware store and started putting it together. We cut bits of pipe to length, and created this strange-looking thing, which looks like some sort of sci-fi creature. It's actually a shower nozzle, which has got 4 little feet to stand at the bottom of the tank, and we would actually put that into the bottom of the tank, and it will spray water up, and that will sort of gently mix around the soil samples that we put in the float tank, and separate them so that the things that we want to recover, like plant matter and animal bones, will separate from the sort of sludge in the mud. There's my friend Rob cutting the little area where we're going to have the water spill off the top of the float tank. And we fit a little metal piece to it to spill the water off and get that sealed in there so the water doesn't leak out. Glue together all the bits and pieces. Obviously, I'm not going to test you on how to make a float tank. I just thought it was interesting to show you the process. And there it is when it's complete. So on top of this, we would put in a fine mesh screen that would let the finest particles of dirt sift through to the bottom, and then actually keep the little stones, but also more importantly the larger artifacts that sink on top of this screen. On the nozzle here on the right, we would attach a hose, and instead of having water flowing out of that nozzle, we'd have water flowing into it to spray up from the bottom so that the material that we want to collect would mostly float off here, and then we would put another kind of a screen on top of this bucket here to collect these things. What kinds of things are we going to learn from paleoethnobotanical and archaeozoological materials? That's faunal remains. Lots and lots and lots of stuff. We're going to learn, obviously, about diet, and that's the sort of the easy one. If you recover a certain kind of plant or a certain kind of animal bone that has, in a house, particularly in a partially cooked form, you can almost be certain that they were cooking it and eating it. But we can also detect a lot of other things. For instance, some plants and animals aren't actually available in certain places, and because we can reconstruct ancient environments, which we'll get to in a second, we can know that. And so we know that whatever the site is like now, Çatalhöyük or Jericho or one of these other sites, we know what would have been available approximately at the time the site was actually occupied. But if we find materials that wouldn't be available there naturally, we know that they're being transported in. So if you find seashells, of course, at these landlocked sites, that clearly is coming in. Same can be said of other plants that grow at higher elevations or lower elevations, or animals that are available, say, in salt water as opposed to the local streams. We can actually chart the development of farming itself, and we sort of had hints of that earlier when I showed those slides from Abu Huraira, that site in Syria, which had seeds of different sizes. Little seeds, the thin seeds, were the non-domesticated ones, and one of the things we could use to tell the domesticated seeds apart was that they had become much larger through that selective breeding by ancient people. If you want to actually chart that process, you need to use paleoethnobotanical techniques to recover those seeds and then to study and understand them. With diet, we're interested in diet not just because it is it's part of economy, but it's actually for most people much more than it is for us. It is something they spend a very large percentage of their time on. We spend some time going to the store and cooking dinner in our cultural system to get the food we need to survive, but we probably spend a lot less time than the folks who lived at Çatalhöyük or Jericho did to get the food that they needed. And so understanding not just how they acquired that food, but how they prepared it, how they ground the grain, how they baked it into bread, is going to really tell you something about family life, about daily life, which is one of the real strengths of archaeology. Butchering also is something that is a big part of this. If you have animal remains, you can get a lot of insight into the process by which people were preparing the food, and that also tells you something about class and class structures. And you can sort of think about that now, actually. We even have, it's a broad generalization, but in our society, certain parts of one animal is higher status than another. Certain animals are higher status than others. A fine steak, a T-bone steak, is maybe something that's a little more expensive. A filet mignon is really expensive, and it's the kind of thing we associate with higher status, with higher wealth. At the other end of the tail, the folks who are making oxtail soup, it's the same animal, but an oxtail is a lot tougher. It's a lot more difficult to make edible. You have to make it into a sort of a big soup. Throwing everything into a pot and letting it cook for a while is a way to stretch your food and make sure it goes farther. And this is something that we might do in the 2016 because we're environmentalists or because we're cheap. I like making a good stew and a good soup, but probably even as recently as 50 or 100 years ago, that kind of cooking was also really marked in terms of status. Rich people could get cuts of meat, and they could get nice cuts of meat. Poorer people had to make do with hog's foot and heads and the non-meaty parts, the tails and things like that, and they would have to find creative ways of making that food palatable to themselves and getting the good nutrition out of it. So, even though we're dealing with these sort of basic questions of, what kind of animal bones are we finding, it's really fair to also say that we're talking a lot about extremely anthropological questions of social relations. One last note about the environment I mentioned before. The environments certainly change over time, and we can use some of the techniques that we were talking about here to actually give us insight into the environments. If we're finding lots and lots of wild plants or animals in a particular site that are unique to particular environments, to particular weather patterns that need either very wet or very dry conditions, we can actually infer what the environment would have looked like at the time those sites were occupied. Oh, just here's an image of some of the bones that we might recover, and you can sort of see the butchery marks here, how people cut them up. Here's another just as a quick side note here, another indication of something really anthropological here. On these top right-hand corner, the bones have been split open so they can get access to the marrow, the really rich, fatty part in the middle of the bone. This is something that we see on a lot of occasions, and sometimes it's an indication of not exactly starvation, but of people really needing to stretch the bones and make sure they get every little calorie out of any animal they find. The last thing, just to go back to the question of environment really quickly, is palynology, which just means the study of pollen. And these sort of bizarre-looking space alien-like things that we're seeing on the screen here are pollen grains. These are the things that make us all miserable in the spring and make us all sneezy and such. Plants create billions of these little things and send them off into the air, which is what causes us distress, but it also is useful for the reconstruction of ancient environments, because some of these will land on other flowers and fertilize them. Some of them will be inhaled by passing humans and make them sneeze, but a lot of them will not, and they'll just sort of settle into nearby lakes. And if the lake is not flowing, if it's not having a fast-moving river coming in or going out, in areas where the lake is relatively still, a lot of times the pollen will just sort of ultimately sink down to the bottom and get stuck in the sediment at the bottom. And so we can actually take cores, we can take sort of vertical slices through the lake bed, and we can reconstruct the different layers stratigraphically of pollen from different species as it is collected at the bottom of the lake bed. And this is really, of course, helpful because some species of plants that create pollen survive in some environments and not in others. And so if we're finding lots and lots of a certain kind of plant, we know it's an environment that's very friendly to that kind of plant. So we can actually chart the way that temperature and the rainfall would have gone up and down in different areas through these kind of animal and plant remains.